welcome to this week's episode of Focus On with myself, Fifi Peters, coming to you from the 28th Conference of the Parties here in Dubai. The conversation today is around sustainable buildings. Now, Africa is currently home to around 1.2 billion people, and the population is expected to increase by more than 300 million by 2030, according to numbers from the United Nations. So more people will need more buildings and more housing. But given that housing relates to around 40% of energy-related gas emissions, new housing and new building projects that do come online will need to incorporate sustainability measures to not only save the planet, but also save owners and tenants much needed lower utility bills. We do have the CEO of the Kenya Green Building Society right now, Ms. Nazra Nanda, for more on this. Nazra, thanks so much for your time.
Thank you too. It's my pleasure to join you today.
Wonderful. So perhaps just give us an understanding of exactly what the Kenya Green Building Society does do and how you are responding to the increasing demand for sustainable buildings in Africa.
Great, thank you so much. So firstly, the Kenya Green Building Society is a membership-based non-profit organization which champions sustainability in the built environment. So our focus isn't just on buildings, and this is deliberate because from a developing market perspective, from an African perspective, housing is not in your buildings alone. The built environment looks at informal settlements as well. Coming to Nairobi, for example, where 60% of the population resides in informal settlements, there's a need for us to tap into the informal sector to ensure that housing is a need that looks at both the formal, mid-income and upper-income communities as well as the low-income. So for us as Kenya Green Building Society, we're working to champion sustainable cities, not just sustainable buildings, as the new face of Africa's winning solution to the climate conversation. For COP, one of the things that we're bringing into the table, because we also chair the Africa Regional Network at the World Green Building Council, we are pushing to unlock financing for cities, because I think that creates a huge opportunity for Africa. And one of the things that we're doing with the county government of Nairobi is we're working towards certifying the mayor's office or the governor's office in Nairobi as the first IFC Edge green government office.
What does that mean? What does that mean and how's that going?
One, it means that we're not just talking as African governments, now we're walking the talk.
Sure.
If the mayor gets his office green certified and we have a first green government building, what essentially we're saying that the industry needs to follow. And we're hoping to send a strong message to investors that Africa is really serious of walking the talk. So we're leading by example by getting governments involved in greening their spaces. And we're hoping then we can leverage this to unlock green financing for the markets in Africa.
And I like the fact that you are talking about Africa as a collective here, because obviously this COP summit, COP28, is happening hot off the heels of the summit that Kenya hosted, the Africa Climate Finance Summit, whereby a whole host of things were discussed, including the signing up of the Nairobi Declaration, where Africa said that they're coming to COP to stand as one voice. So just talk to us about that and how you reckon that could help you in some of the things that you're trying to achieve here.
So I think for me it's really important to talk about the entire African bloc because one, our aim is to leave no one behind.
Sure.
I think in the past our mistake as Africans is every country was negotiating individually. So that means then you're not coming up with one single strong voice. By having the Nairobi Climate Summit, the Nairobi Declaration at the Africa Climate Summit, what we're saying is we're sending a message first that Africa is taking charge of its narrative, and Africa is coming to the table to argue for its common position in driving these negotiations. So it's powerful because we're saying now we want to take charge, but also we're saying Africa is the one to decide what that means for itself. And so for us, in terms of the built environment, that's key because housing is a key problem for the rapidly urbanizing continent of Africa.
Sure.
And also, with housing, we can create green jobs. So how does that look like for the youth of Africa? So framing it as a regional priority, of course, gives it more strength. And I'm hoping that with housing as a conversation, then we can look at green jobs. Because if you don't have food and shelter, it's very, very hard to talk about all the other fancy stuff that, are more global north priorities than the global south. Yeah.
Sure. So addressing the bread and butter issues, essentially, are the giving a roof over people's heads.
Yes.
Now, you said that you are here to leverage the investment platform here and try and plug the financing gap. And we do know that in terms of the climate financing gap on the continent, it runs into the trillions of dollars. But when it does come to the segment that you work in, housing and building specifically, what is the size of that gap? And I suppose more importantly, how much do you need right now?
So that's the interesting part. So an approximation of the green conversation, we're looking at $1.3 trillion. That's the opportunity, or that's the gap,
sure.
Right? But for us, we're saying that if we were to look at it from an African perspective, that's a huge number. But I can only start with, for example, Kenya. We need 6 million homes by 2030. 6 million homes and an average of an affordable house for 2 or 3 bedrooms ranging to 3 million Kenyan shillings, which is probably $30,000. What are we looking at? We're looking at probably $30,000 times 3 million just for Kenya alone to tackle affordable housing. But it's a plethora. But what we're trying to say is, if we start showing it, like we're taking the initiatives, could we come together and not just argue for Africa to get adaptation assistance from a financing perspective? We want 3 things, essentially. Number 1, we want to say we're leading by example. That's why we have governments taking this initiative to green their offices. What that means is we need now technical support or institutional support. We need green experts to help us with the transition. That's 1. 2, in terms of our sector priorities, housing is one of them. So we would need to look at the nature of, in terms of the percentage the housing or the built environment will take up in the broader conversation. So if Africa is asking for example, $100 million, then what percentage of that should be housing? For me, given that housing and real estate take up about 39% of the CO2 conversations, then could we be targeting 39% of that 100 million? So from a percentage perspective, I think we need to be having a huge or better stake at the table when it comes to negotiating. Yeah.
Because right now, we are seeing some of the most devastating weather events and occurring in more frequent or occurring more frequently than we have seen in the past. And we've seen a lot of people's homes being displaced and being essentially left homeless as a result of the droughts and a lot of flooding, in fact, that's happening in your side of town. So just, what does that mean for the type of housing that does come on stream right now? And also help us understand the resilience of these buildings that you're talking about to some of these adverse climate events.
Great. And I think what's super important is in the past, and in the past I mean as early as this year, January, the buildings conversation was not in consideration at a regional platform or even a national platform. So there was a lot of work put in to even get the built environment on the table this year, starting from the UN Habitat General Assembly with the Africa Climate Summit, and now, as you rightly pointed out, with the flooding that's happening and the drought, both are playing a key role in now shaping Kenya's way forward. So currently we're having what we call NCAP, or the National Climate Change Action Plan for Kenya, which is currently under review for the 2023 and 2027 period. So what we've said is that the built environment needs to be part of that climate action plan, because there are these communities in these spaces who are affected. So resilience would look like, number 1, could we set aside a budget beforehand that would serve to protect these communities living in these spaces which are prone to flooding, so that they are already going to be supported in building better homes that are more resilient to these changes. Alternatively, what is the support for structures which are already existing? It means maybe they have to rebuild or create some sort of mid-ground where they incorporate materials that could help them become more sturdy. right now, nothing's been done. We're saying let's start somewhere, one step at a time. So locally available materials, which are low carbon by nature, should be incorporated to that. But there needs to be also a fund set aside, which combines both foreign, regional, and locally available sources towards, the built environment. And this needs to be incorporated in NCAP. So my aim really is to say, even as we go into COP, that the built environment needs to be considered in key messaging. Whatever it is that we're going to ask for in a broader category as Africa, a percentage to that needs to be towards the built environment. And thirdly, now as we think about this resilience aspects, we need to be reprogram ourselves. We're reactive. We need to be proactive. And I think that's my main message. Yeah.
And just a last question on the jobs opportunity. You touched on it just a little bit, but just what kind of scale and the creation of livelihoods are we looking at here?
So we're looking at, so far, from a Nairobi perspective, the figure is about 5 million green jobs.
Wow, yeah.
And that's huge. But aside from that, I think I also want to tap into the informal sector here as well. So from community perspective, when we talk about informal settlements, there's the huge potential of converting informal settlements into green communities. So if we look at the community as key players in driving waste management, for example, you would have green jobs which are not necessarily blue collar. And I think that in itself is a huge opportunity that we've not tapped into as a developing market.
Sure.
So that figure of 5 million could actually rapidly increase, maybe to even 10 million. The question is, who gets to start this conversation in a manner that reflects it both at a regional capacity, national capacity, and local capacity? Whatever it may be, we hope that the built environment and the opportunity it provides can anchor those conversations in a way that benefits communities.
I think the question has already been posed by yourselves and the various partners that you're working with. The answer, we hope, will be a positive one, particularly in providing for the growing need of sustainable homes on this continent, as well as the much-needed jobs, particularly for the youth. But Nazra, we'll leave it there for now, ma'am. Thanks so much for your time. Nazra Nanda, the CEO of the Green Building Society of Kenya, helping us wrap up this week's Focus On, coming to you from COP28 in Dubai. From myself, Fifi Peters, thanks so much for watching, and see you next time.